Embedded Contradiction by Michael Fahl. Reading to epistemology, ontology, phenomenology, the diagram. These three domains can inflate and deflate, eclipsing over the other two depending on preference. A triad of philosophical domains. Epistemology, ontology, phenomenology are all domains from which philosophers can prefer an approach to knowledge, being, and consciousness, as well as any other aspects of our thinkings, doings, pondering, etc. The phenomenologist denotes the qualia of being, our organism's consciousness, as it engages sensual datum. So, speaking from the phenomenologist's point of view, the statement, knowledge comes from experience, could be paraphrased as, our conscious experience comes prior to our communal engagement in knowledge. This is to say that our human organisms experience the world consciously without having the function of language. In order for the human organism to learn to speak, we must first engage haptically and sensually with our universe and come to contrast depth and volume, texture and color, and tastes and sounds, although it is difficult, if not outright impossible, for most of us to remember being prelingual, lingual being the domain of, for, knowledge, and hence the domain of epistemology. We can witness and observe other human organisms as they reach out into the world and further ruminate on contrasts of what they are seeing and sensing, with spitting, drooling, farting, pooping, etc., comparing what is sensed and not sensed, or changes among the senses, as well as between our binary sense organisms, or organs, 2 ears, 2 eyes, 2 nostrils, and our 2 arms, legs, hands, feet, etc. The human infant does all of this contrasting, experiencing, and orienting prior, and then alongside with registering vocal, sound, reiterations, mouth movements, and bodily gestures. The ability of humans to have retention and protraction within memory allow them to solidify vocal sound correspondence to many number of variables. In other words, it is inferred from the total activity of our genetic makeup that we are, as humans compile a totalizing effect upon entering into one's language, one's mother tongue, and seamlessly beyond this into one's epistemology. With a burp, hiccup, or fart, a child registers the response behaviors of those around them, as well as contrasting those bodily sounds from the symbolic and iconic impact of its vocal utterances. Our youthful organism's lips, teeth, and tongue individually conform in multivarious positions relative to the breath to form initial articulation, most often a repetition of what it just heard. First in ecstatic mimicry, and then in referenced correspondence to presented object items. Knowledge, as a re-reflective articulation of one's command over mutually communally held concepts understood via words, is the epistemologists' ground from which they claim knowledge is a priori. The ontologist may see the prelingual infant reaching for an item like a ball, bring it to their mouth, lick it, and then cast the ball away and claim that the infant knows that the ball is not food. The infant engaging with confidence with their organismal properties, senses, abounding together, or in pre-ordered, pre-controlled congress, may not be able to themselves form articulation, yet respond to a parent's vocal articulations such that it is fair to imply the word knowledge here, and say the infant knows that others are speaking to or with them in dialogues and groups. Because the infant is registering correct responses to commands, names, titles, etc., via hearing, albeit without being able to themselves speak, we rightfully can describe that the infant found the distinct difference from one series of sounds as meaningful from merely arbitrary differences of sound. Parents realize when their baby understands specifically articulated content. This ability reveals that the child is grasping lingual meanings. I speculate that this ability indicates that the child is responding to meaning beyond itself, and doing so in a responsively focused manner and not merely reacting to sounds. It is here that the consciousness is suspected to be drawing into itself its basis for compiling data. Still, this early in development ability is outside of the domain of epistemology. The ontologist here may argue that this special knowledge is a form of retention of memory and hence a posteriori. Oddly enough, this a posteriori knowledge is occurring prior to knowledge that is said to be a priori. Yet the phenomenologist says, experience that I know something, experience that I have knowledge within a strictly reductive triad of apprehending, hearing, being human. This isn't to say that phenomenologists must reduce consciousness to the material organism's bodily abilities and attributes, and consciousness parsed off from the material aspects of the world is their domain of study. Compare intentional versus phenomenal states of mind. This is to say that pointing to, referencing merely ideas or concepts with no empirical referent. This is to say that the phenomenologist references the content of their experiences, whether sensual occurring physiological instances or abstract ideas and concepts which emerge. The phenomenologist is referencing the content of experience opposed to referencing the propositions which may be utilized to reference this content. So it is inferred that by using the term about our senses, we are not only referring to our senses, but to our cognition of our senses, and secondly, of being sensible. Or should I say, more to the point, and hence registering knowingly via the gnosis of the community which senses you back, that one is within rational and functional utilities of form, aka understood at basic accepted levels of being aware, and being aware tacitly of the structure of language. I say structure of language opposed to propositional content, as the apprehension of language and its grammatical forms differ than focusing on the meaning found within the analysis of a proposition's content or meaning. Consider noting that a foreign language like Chinese or Arabic is a language without being able point to the content nor meaning of the characters apprehended. From the primordial prelingual cries of each of us as a freshly born babies through a couple years of conditioning, we enter into the formalities of using grammar and rules of our mother tongue. The laws of logic are merely an expression of discrete rule formalization. This formalization, which seems ubiquitous, is wrong-headedly mistaken as the predicate for rule following itself. Rule following is replaced with axioms, and what our common human organism is capable of performing and forming through process is supplemented with Platonic-like static axioms. As if the first few years of our post-uteral existence were erased as a palimpsest and exchanged carte blanche with the laws of logic. This disjunctive counterfeit replaces what we humans forget or are incapable of remembering about this dilated period of time in which our senses slowly allowed us to respond, mirror, mimic, and form our behavior and tongue into speech. And beyond this, years after this entrance into speech, we peer back onto how we got here, how we came to understand. Without memory of our primordial selves, we overtly claim that our matured understanding of inherited laws were there, predicating our thinking from the beginning. Our blindness keeps the audacity of our conclusion from arising. The vacancy for our oversight is ironically often occupied by implicit epistemological dogmatism, namely that philosophers often subsume prelingual, pre-articulate, pre-recursive, pre-claim, pre-self-knowledge states into their epistemological domain ardently as to argue that that which is a priori predates that which is a posteriori, i.e., that that which is known before that which is experienced. And this is only true when including the knowledge of those who came before the newly born human, and is false when only considering the newly born. The vacancy for our audacity is ironically often occupied by biblical isomorphisms, namely the registration of the laws of logic as axioms along with the receipt agreeing with the axioms are mirrored theologically, as 20th century formal logic is projected via eisegesis into biblical texts. The audacious contemporary Christian theologist blindly presumes this modern formation of logic per se were expressed in 6th century BC and 1st century AD biblical writings, so much so as to divine modern formal and propositional logic. Even though logic has come a long way since Aristotle, 322 BC, the theologist is confounded by the modern formalization of logic into principles or laws, so much they conflate them with God's divinity. Believing that the laws of logic are isomorphic with God's nature, they assume them as predicate to our being implicitly and dogmatically in the same blind way as the epistemologist. Next chapter. The ongoing metamy of the non-cliche. Each domain of the triad can be used as justified true domains, opposed to Western philosophy's relationship to the word knowledge, such that knowledge is justified true belief. In order to reference concepts, one holds such that doubt is unreasonable or not assumed unless unreliability occurs or is conceived as able to occur. It seems like the problem is with one's preferring one's justifications of events over one's making sense out of events. When one ascribes assumptions and or assumptiveness towards events such that what arises in the mind that looks like language are merely elemental language clumps, or with regards to speaking, language which arises in the form of empty speech acts, but are patterned as grammatically correct forms, logical mind parts, with possible or probable use, but are responses to the human organism registering what the events in their life might conjure or correlate as justified nonsense, or what many others call word salad. All of this is to apprehend language like the human might apprehend non-lyrical music. That the language is a series of registered sounds with accents and shapes, which only oscillates into meaningful areas from time to time. This person would be said to be thinking about their senses prior to thinking about their thoughts, but denoting their thoughts as the thoughts arise, and then positing them as Platonic or elemental formulations, such that if God knows all true forms without knowing all true propositions, then can infer from a form that there must exist a corresponding truth, via stellation, speculation of extension. The stellated form may then be believed by mere arithmetical associated principle to be geometrically aligned with some other Platonic, granulated, patterned form, such that any lingual act might be emptied or re-engineered to align with its context's reducible form, as if all reasonable content of speech must either correspond with a mental form signified, or exist as functional aspects of language, excluding the accepted structuring of language, either phenomenal or intentional. For example, consider this to the more empirically referential and spatiologically assumed, "Can you open that?" The former corresponds to the world referent, or a lingual referent, where the latter corresponds only objects in the world, or a metaphor of opening an aspect of language, aka unpack this. At least some theory of concatenated language forms can coincide with Platonic forms. Think of the third option placed above a dichotomy, such as is the case in neutral monism. First via triangles as atomic forms, then into lingual spatial domains, such as to analogize alytity to pyramids and tetrahedrons. At least it is fair to make conjecture about people who form analogous geometries in their minds as dual signifieds, which correspond to language's semantic content. In the form of forms, a three-dimensional mental picture may and does arise as supplement or lagging supplement to the mere apprehension of lingual content. Consider Daniel Tammet. One can be analytical to these word bits as internally justifiable remnants of sensing patterns of, in, qualia, and then wrapping adjectives together which speak to that pattern, that mental form, whether the pattern is recognized by the general public as such, and which may be too complex for the experiencer of the pattern or mental form to articulate or describe coherently with corresponding accuracy to those incapable of holding dual or concurrent types of simultaneous signifieds. One which is of the basic apprehended structure and attributes of language, alongside that which has paralinguistic forms beyond the currently defined domain of communication. The general understanding of propositions in modern language are enough for individuals to get along through life. Additional mental abilities such as running spatial forms or geometric forms alongside and in concert to their mind's interior pictures as it registers propositions and linguistic patterns yields greater calibrations for that individual which may serve them well or poorly to a greater degree than the average mind. The rest retain semi-fixed worldviews. Seems like one can know the purported content of a proposition without making the focus upon the proposition itself, such that the proposition, as it sits within the structure of a particular language where the grammatical functions take on an analogous spatial form, which may, like that of a dream, yield, let's say, a dodecahedron, and the content of the proposition would be like a dodecahedron via inverse stellation off of some mentally perceived lattice, which defines a structure of the grammatical interplay, verbs coming after nouns, etc. From grapheme to the whole robust writing system, consider apprehending the meaning of a word even if it is written in reverse in graffiti. We have satellites that project and have cameras upon our spherical Earth from orbit. Each satellite can never see the whole of the globe, but each relatively placed satellite is patterned about the globe such that the pattern in conjunction with the attributes of each satellite in network can yield a composite map of the globe via a series of orthographically read images of the globe, and satellites peer under the crust of the Earth via inverse stellated orthographic imagery, stellated at the surface. Next chapter. Contradiction examples. This is not a category error, but a category contextual preferencing, a category reconsideration, an additional category. Michael Fahl, author. There is an entertainment that one can infer that there is an entanglement which runs a strataline through the distance between contradictions, such as to allow a contradiction to be recognized as an entertainable dissonant pattern, which should be expected with all critiques of the difference between you and any other individual on the planet, but more specifically on punchlines, which comedians make. The meaning of one term, use of some phrase or narrative may have multiple meanings which are in contra to one another. Not saying people live naturally within the environment of contradictions, but that travel yields aspirations differently when traveling. Traveling into another's comedy routine carries much the frequency of double meanings, which many may appear contradictory. Piraha and Chomsky. I had an argument once about semiotic atoms, or the idea of the smallest semantical unit found within all languages, which seemed to undermine the lack of lingual recursivity found within the Piraha culture, found, I believe, in Ecuador, but South America nonetheless, where the people could not count above 4, where the sentences were short and automized, where people only believed in what they themselves witnessed, and to not entrust anyone else's accounts, and where this lingual population could not embed a term like the following in such a manner that Abuga went to the stream to get some cooking water to bring back to their neighbors, because their grammatical form would be much more empirically appropriated to the lowest of verbal triads. Abuga, go water. Abuga, come back. They cook. Point of all this is to show a communal difference is not only language content, but language type differences, such that even Chomsky suggested there were no exceptions to his notion of universal grammar, or the attributes which describe the lowest common denominators of every language system. This is to say, every language man is capable of. Object that cannot stop hits an object which cannot move. So when the object that cannot stop runs into the object which cannot move, what happens? I'd like to name the dissonant mental imagery one has when attempting to orchestrate a correspondence with physical reality with what they conceive, whereby the model of such an event would have any relation to how Newtonian physics might work. If not, just consider what their model of such a thing might look like. For me, neither of these two objects are physically conceivable, yet they are mentally and logically conceivable. Just that the effect of the object which could not stop ricocheting off of the object which could not move, and do so under the idea that the object which could not move could also not vibrate. Such a non-effect of this event has not Newtonian correspondence with what we generally deem as true, correct, agreed upon. So the strata between the idea of a logically possible world and a physically possible world yield a dissonant realm of varied and variable considerations, such as, could the object which can't move internally as vibration and still be considered an object which doesn't move? Simply because its relative location stayed the same. Could the object that couldn't move simply be a metaphor for a logically possible object in some CGI imaginative video game, but not have any real correspondence with day-to-day publicly shared physics? Could the object which could not stop at least slow down? Could the same object that could not stop also not stop its particular speed? Is a triad of entanglement considered entanglement which gives one pause, a room to pause, a moment or tense in which to ponder all that one might ponder about exceptions, which might allow a paradox to be mixed up with the corresponding contradiction in physics, or at least an unallowable attempt in physics, which wouldn't be dissimilar to moving something physical and about with the mere power of one's words, one saying so. Square circles. Many people assume that the phrase denoting a square circle to be gibberish and or nonsensical, and hence the term, name, title, square circle is meaningless or non-meaningful. This refusal to find a meaning which corresponds to a referent where others are able of extracting meaning and meaningful content as it relates to such a referent shows a dogmatic alignment or a symptom of dogmatic resistance to which they will hurry to keep up a formal maintenance around and a particular categorization history while eschewing all other categorical domains from which a claim with referent does yield meaning per se. For example, let me call the illustration below an example of a square circle. Now, it is a sophisticated matter which one attuned to Western philosophy and logic has to go to when disclaiming this illustration. They might say that it doesn't fall within the mathematical description of what a square or circle are defined as, and hence it is not the case that the illustration below is of a square circle. The ebb from this contention is that one might easily condition a class of children to call this shape a square circle, such that the term takes on an alternative category, which is not mathematically or logically orthodox, but nonetheless asserting that even children can conceive of this illustration referred to as a square circle, forces the dogmatist to allow an exceptional category in which to grant square circles their place within the domain of meaning. This dogmatist is unsympathetic to this allowance and in later discussion reiterate what they were initially claiming with a new caveat, generally in the form of a prefix. They might say a true square can never be a true circle, or that mathematically the outline below does not qualify as either a square nor a circle, or whatever that is not what we mean by square. The argument may continue into optics, namely, how closely do you want to look at this concept? The contention about the illustration might continue where the orthodox dogmatists might give a little with regards to the domain of what is meaningful, while at the same time tightening up and constraining the context in order to disclaim future allowances. The interlocutor might also refine their definition, calling the illustration of a square circle a squirrel or a squirrel. They may continue speaking about a cylinder, which from a side view appears square, and from another view appears and is referenced as a circle or circular. The dogmatist says that it's not even a square circle, it's more like a rectangle oval, finally adjusting their thoughts about the idea. The real problem is not defining a square circle, but squaring the circle, which is not treated in this writing. An agreement, orientation, categorization, context, and stemming come into play. By stemming, I mean the school, paradigm, or history from which an idea or an idea as a word signified stems from. Married bachelor, a type of dialetheism that I want to put forth, is an imbricated lingual deferment goes on such that the bachelor may be a married man via these following cases indexes. 1. Bachelor is unmarried if a multivariable situation occurs such that more than one of the following occurs. A. After ceremony, because the Jewish bride-to-be previously vowed that she would never marry a non-Jewish man, finds out that her husband, was not Jewish. B. When asked if the man takes the bride, the man clears his throat, yet the sound is construed by all attending and interpreted as his affirmation, and so he and all behave as if the vows were proper and completed. C. The person marrying the couple is not legally permissible to do so, e.g. their license to perform this function may have lapsed but is currently assumed to be legitimate, or the priest conducting the ceremony may no longer be in good religious standing. The communal aspect, aka the community observing the wedding, has observed a marriage, but the legitimacy is unknown. There are not enough witnesses of the wedding. The community beyond the couple and the priest was but one other person. If the wedding is procured via true vows, where vows are valued and strict, then A would disclaim the marriage vow. If a man made no intentional vow, but allowed a counterfeit vow to stand in as his vow, he may indefinitely presume that he did not commit. If the person performing the ceremony whose status to marry is unknown, then the performance may only be recognized by witness attesting to the fact. If there is only but one witness, then corroboration of the ceremony, and hence marriage is absent. 2. A man named Bachelor gets married. A nominal disparity. 3. A man whom after being married lives as if this never occurred, segmented away entirely from any notion, practice, or behavior which might be construed as being in accordance with marriage, married by legal decree alone. 4. A man who lives in a situation which resembles marriage in all observable fashions, yet does not meet the definition of even common law marriage. 5. The marriage is never consummated, remains in a time frame of annulment. In lieu of some situational wedding processes, and in lieu of a final authority about if some guy is married or not, one might not have an excluded middle world beyond opinions of players, varying opinions, such that a man might believe himself to be bachelor, but still socially or legally be considered married. This is why there is persistence about the law of excluded middle, as the one-world view classified as reality. In lieu of some situational wedding processes, and in lieu of a final authority about if some guy is married or not, one might not have an excluded middle world beyond opinions of players' varying opinions, such that a man might believe himself to be a bachelor but still socially or legally be married. So when faced with the question of, are you married, a man might say maybe, or yes and no, or it's not certain, or in some ways yes, in some ways no, and I don't know. The point is to leave one in an unresolvable heap in all of these quests for truth. Not because this is great, but because it can be done, and is therefore possible that it be done. It is to prefer disagreement over coming to agreement. It helps you disjoin from the conditioned belief that we must agree, or should have to agree. We don't, you don't, I, the author, won't. This is important to suspend agreement, and hence agreement of truth, such that there is a disposition which allows various positions to come together and be stuck together. The exception to my lack of agreement is for the sake of day-to-day utility, but as far as people telling me or you what you must or should assess is mostly a mob mentality, even if almost all humanity is that mob. Even or odd. Argument 1. The contention of even or odd argument bases itself on a number of items in the real world which correspond to the natural numbers, whereby because the natural numbers are either even or odd, that is projected upon the items in the empirical world are also even or odd. The problem with this contention is found in a couple of examples. Here is a paraphrased claim by Sam Harris. The number of hairs on my body is either even or odd. And then he continues talking about how this is a non-negotiable fact. Or Matt Dillahunty holds up a jar and says this jar of gumballs has either an even number of gumballs in it, or it has an odd number of gumballs in it. To Sam, I would say that the issue with enumerating the number of hairs on your head is that you are speaking about a state of existence which would need to be snapshotted in time in order to be counted as being the case. And this is opposed to actually counting the number of hairs on your body by hand. For the problem with counting is that by the time you finish counting, new hairs would have arisen, old ones would fall out, so you would never be able to get a concise answer to the question so critical of one single error. Secondly, the definition of what defines a hair would have to be exactly determined in order to begin counting, as a follicle with some conjoined molecules within it wouldn't constitute a hair, and to what extent does a clump of molecules greater in length than it is in width constitute a hair? Is fuzz considered hair? Is fuzz-like hair considered hair? I contend, Sam, that there is not an even nor odd amount of hair upon your body, as this belief is misaligned to issues of empirical projection of the natural numbers onto one's body, entropy and definition and exception. And since there can exist at all times a single exception to what constitutes a hair, then there exists no correspondence to the natural numbers. To Matt, I would say something similar. Matt, what is the smallest spherical-shaped object within the jar made of gum which constitutes a gumball? Are there not minute gumballs in that jar? Of what of that gumball missing a chunk is there a gumball? And that other chunk of gum which looks like a Siamese gumball, where obviously there are more one spherical arch to that supposed gum clump you want to call a ball, is that a single gumball? And then I would have to insist that Matt was seeking agreement, per se, first about what a gumball was, and was defined as, first, before he demanded that the projection of the natural numbers as a numerical concept be projected onto the number of items within the jar. In both of these cases, the variable definitions keep the even or oddness at odds with itself. If we cannot agree about the number of gumballs, or what qualifies as a gumball and what might not, or from what manner or perspective this reference is to be called a gumball, then the assessment of whether the quantity is even or odd is left in debate, and hence a quagmire of an unresolved heap. For if there exists any variance in this particular matter, an agreement on an amount predicates the question of even or odd quantities. Argument 2. Suppose not x is the negation of x. X equals, I believe the gumballs are odd. Not x equals, I believe the gumballs are not odd. But here, if you reject x as being false, then you do automatically accept not x, meaning you believe that they are even. Law of excluded middle. If you reject x, you're just not accepting the claim of the claimant. You lack a belief in x. That does not mean that you automatically accept not x, as you could also lack a belief in not x too, making you agnostic on the gumballs being even or odd. Or, what is the not x of x? If given x equals, I believe the gumballs are odd, is not x equal, I believe the gumballs are not odd? Or not x equals, I don't believe the gumballs are odd? In predicate form, we would have lowercase I equals I, uppercase B equals do believe, lowercase g equals gumballs, uppercase O equals are odd. I do believe gumballs are odd. BI equals OG. I do not believe gumballs are odd. Not BI equals OG. I believe gumballs are not odd. BI equals not OG. A second party comments puts it like this. B, P, they believe that P, or P is a proposition, the scope distinction comes in due to the possibility of negation, for negation. B, not P, they believe that not P. Not B, P, it is not the case that they believe that P. If P is the gumballs are odd, then I don't believe that P, i.e. not believe the proposition. But it's not that I believe that not P, i.e. believe in not the proposition, which makes perfect sense to me. But what is not x if x equals, I believe the gumballs are odd? Where does the negation go? Before the believe, the action, or before odd, the condition of the objects. Discuss. By the way, it has been noted that the correct form of this negation is x. I believe the gumballs are odd. Not x equals, not I believe the gumballs are odd, which is the same as not x. I do not believe the gumballs are odd. It also has been noted that general logic sucks balls when trying to do logic dealing with belief, which is why there is doxaxic logic. My response comment. You could default at almost any time that by odd you mean to necessitate its relationship to even, when odd could simply mean it's not like, but in deviation from the other gumballs. Of course, I just mentioned this to apply the same use of your last use of not x in not x equals not I believe the gumballs are odd, which is the same as not X equals I do not believe the gumballs are odd, where not X equals not I believe the gumballs are odd, which doesn't require the dichotomy of odd-even to be within all domains of all possible negations. This argument is based on a difference between a claim of fact and a doxaxic claim of belief about a fact. One must come to an agreement of identity first in order to approximate a claim of fact. If there is a retort to this other than grammatical or punctuation issue, let me know. Otherwise, I might frame the sentence as not X equals not I believe the gumballs are odd. I just know that they are tasty. Whereby the interpretation might be it's not I who believes the gumballs are odd nor even. A case of dialetheism. Not X1 to X1 parenthetical proposition and not P equals not P, therefore P compared to not X1 to X1 not P or R. Argument 3. These are issues of periodicism. A tree identical with itself but loses a leaf. Like endure, but per change of time with identity, maintaining while things shifting or existing via a worm theorist. And fourth dimensional, a temporal worm of shifting while maintaining self-identification. Tentative contingent. A equals A, where the second A, by virtue of being second, is represented by A, by lowercase a, such that uppercase A equals lowercase a. So A equals A, so capital A equals capital A equals lowercase a, whereby some A's are capital A's and some A's are lowercase a's. Equivalence holds on some aspect of the case. Otherwise, case as a category ceases to mean case. But the identical of capital A with capital A holds in some cases, and yet capital A has some other domain, e.g. subjective or aspect, such as a signified mental image is variable or not fixed, or as an aspect such as a perspective upon an object, whereby capital A equals lowercase a. The contingent identity may calcify in some cases and become variant in others, such as objects with entropic categories, aka Pyderianism. Hylomorphism, the doctrine that physical objects result from the combination of matter and form. In order to elucidate this final argument about even or oddness as it applies to speaking of items in the world, I want to restate that agreement is required, rudimentary agreement, but that the means of this agreement is under contention. Consider Fodor and Piatelli Palmerini's retort to the idea of Darwin's natural selection, whereby they make a disjunct between that which is conceptual per se from that which is empirical. Fodor and Palmerini suggest a counterfactual yet logically conceivable world where the mammals had ancestors who either had hearts or did not have hearts, and that our modern stock, which has hearts, prevailed. Yet Fodor and Palmerini speak upon the idea that perhaps the heart was selected for based on its sound opposed to its ability to circulate blood, that the thub-dub sound trait is considered as coextensive to the circulation trait, and therefore, logically, we couldn't conclude certainly which trait was selected for. I bring this up as an elucidation for argument 3 because as we attempt to apply reason onto the world, whereby we often first point to the empirical world as a shared referent, we find that contrary descriptions of the case, as well as other theories about the case, arise, and that this disjunct occurs between the logically conceivable domain and the empirically insisted upon domain. The coextensiveness of this argument is that the law of the excluded middle, as has been denoted to the principle of the excluded middle, is also under fire, such as to avow my argument that contradictions not only exist, but they exist within these disjuncts, a case of dialetheism. Yet, let's assume that this issue is a matter of contradiction, that what I prefer to above as a sound trait or a circulation trait are to be eliminated, erased. Instead, I say that heat itself is a trait, and that sound and the circulation are aspects of that trait, such that the aspects are not selected for, but a Darwinian may argue that a heart is still a trait, and that it was, at some time in the history of organismal evolution, was selected for. The argument might shift now to coextension, as what is a trait of an organism as coextending to a trait of an organism's environment, e.e., we can draw a coextension between fins and water. But what would we say of fins in air? Is a horse's mane a type of fin which it was selected for as a terrestrial animal in the same manner as a fish fin is selected for relative to its environment, namely water? Although my hope is to keep the reader focusing on investigating contradictions, particularly with a bit of philosophical exceptions smuggled into play, a type of mathematical clarity is available to help me condemn my propagation of contradiction as abounding in all cases of thinking about the world. So consider the distinction between a substance and an attribute, a class with members and a class concept, a proposition in terms of propositions. With a class concept may or may not be a term of its own extension. A class concept, which is not a term of its own extension, appears to be a class concept. But if it is a term of its own extension and vice versa, thus we must conclude, against appearances, that class concept, which is not a term of its own extension, is not a class concept. In terms of classes of contradictions, appears even more extraordinarily a class, as one may be a term of itself as many. Thus, the class of all classes is a class. The class of all terms that are not men is not a man, and so on. Do all classes that have the property form a class? If so, is it as one a member or itself as many, or not? If it is, then it is one of the classes which, as ones, are not members of themselves, and as many, and vice versa. Let Bx be the propositional function correlated with x. Then, if the correlation covers all terms, the denial of Bx, x, will be a propositional function, since it is a proposition for all values of x, but it cannot be included in the correlations. For if it were correlated with a, Bax, would be equivalent for all values of x, the denial of Ba, equivalent to its own denial. It follows that there are more propositional functions than terms. In other words, if B is an aspect of thub-dub and A is moving blood, and X is the heart itself, intrinsic and intentional of itself, then let thub-dub heart be a propositional function, correlated with moving blood, then if correlation covers all terms, the denial of thub-dub heart, the heart, will be a propositional function, since it is a proposition for all values of the heart, but it cannot be included in the correlations. For if it were correlated with moving blood, thub-dub, moving blood heart, would be equivalent for all values of the heart to the denial of thub-dub moving blood, equivalent to its own denial. In other words, the thub-dub of the heart is a substance of the heart, substantial for the heart, and not merely an attribute or merely an aspect of the heart, then we can't grant it a class concept apart from the heart. If both the thub-dub and the moving of blood were coextensive subsets or members of a class of heart, the selection of one minus the other would either remove the identity of heart or the physics of friction causing sound and heart, any action of heart. Fodor is wrong-headedly projecting coextension onto rudimentary, required, intrinsic, defined aspects within an organism. Fodor presumes that the sound aspect is akin to the phenotypic trait, in that sound expresses itself outward into the environment. It's as if he himself has purposely misapplied coextension with intention to engorge an intellectual consideration, whereby doing so has brought no insight into the pragmatics of biology. For one could consider that the friction intrinsic to a heart yielding sound to have necessary to its definition of volume loud enough to project into the exterior world, had Fodor made his thesis about the appendix, a vestigial organ relative to and as coextensive property to the intestinal tract, whereby the presence of the appendix was selected for over the absence, he would have been much more successful at his attempt to debunk and defame natural selection per se. There is plenty of better criticism of Darwin's natural selection as knowledge of genetics and genetics in populations has increased than Fodor's argument, as there are better criticisms of Fodor's argument online than I am attempting to clarify in a few paragraphs. Nonetheless, as it stands, Darwinian selection is about organisms within an environment being selected for by other natural facts within said environment, and not organs nor aspects of organisms, organs being selected for, as Fodor attempts to pontificate. Organisms are successful at propagating or not. Organs are not propagated minus the host organism. (101, 102) above and 105 and 106 below are sections of Bertrand Russell's The Principles of Mathematics. Section 105. A natural suggestion for escaping from the contradiction would be to demur to the notion of all terms and all classes. It might be urged that no such sum total is conceivable, and if all indicates a whole, our escape from the contradiction requires us to admit this. But we have already abundantly seen that if this view were maintained against any term, all formal truths would be impossible, and mathematics, whose characteristic is the statement of truths concerning any term, would be abolished at one stroke. It is here that I ask the reader to present texts to hold demur, for a special class concept is required to allow mathematical functions to predicate themselves. Russell continues, thus the correct statement of formal truths requires a notion of any term or every term, but not the collective notion of all terms. It should be observed finally that no peculiar philosophy is involved in the above contradiction, which springs directly from common sense, and can only be solved by abandoning some common sense assumption. Yet my aim is to present text is ask the reader to focus on what does abound about them in terms of exceptions to abandoning common sense, for the sake of formal truth. And if not, then to realize that the eschewing of contradiction is but a formality for a formal process, while contradictions go unnoticed and noticed but sidestepped quite often. And general language use requires a meta-use of language prescribed to people, as well as special class, special pleading, for other classes of cases, where classes of many and classes of one are elemental to variations of concepts of classes, which are plural, class concepts, which are either plural or one. 106. Subject-predicate propositions and such are expressed a fixed relation to a fixed term could be analyzed, we found, into a subject and an assertion, but this analysis become impossible when a given term enters into a proposition in more complicated manner than as referent of a relation. Hence, it became necessary to take propositional function as a primitive notion. Discrete logical units relative to an exclusive domain, or the Groucho Marx phrase, I wouldn't want to belong to a club that would have me as a member, or violation of Russell's paradox, where someone attempts to both be the predicate for the set as well as being a member of its own set. Like putting a foam cup into another identically similar cup. The inner and higher cup is not a predicate cup. The cup holding the second cup is the predicate cup and does not hold itself. It holds a duplicate of itself. To be and to be one's context. To be and to also be one's own context. To be interactively solipsistic. To be solipsistic and yet interact with oneself as the other. To indefinitely include one's own logically congruent Mandelbrot set type notion of oneself within an infinitely outbound repatterning, while still being an individuated discrete unit rooted within grounded embodiment and embodiment's sensual limitations, yet being able to vicariously and empathetically walk in that person's shoes and not assume them sui generis of their own accord and majesty. Or like a cup, which is merely just a cup, being just a cup, X cup. But oh wait, that same cup is my mom's cup, and it reminds me of my grandma's place whenever she'd cook. Not that I ate there much, but it's not any longer merely a cup, just a cup, but yes, it's still that cup, but now that X cup is now sentimental Y cup. But it is the same cup. The owner's sentimental devotion towards the object makes the object also contextual, and hence beyond its own original indifferent mundane utility as merely an object or cup. The cup object became stellated to be both itself and beyond itself in contra. Could be said here to have isomorphically transmorphigured at the same time, just looked at from alternative vantage points of focus, approach, or care. Invoking the overlaying transparency, Stephen Jay Gould, famous paleontologist, punctuated equilibrium idea thesis concerning natural selection. I propose that dialetheism opposed to dialetheism are punctuated awarenesses of discongruities which mimics a contradiction, but are events in human consideration that are not direct A and not A contradictions, but are lingual reapproaches or nostalgic meanings reappropriated to one's contemporaneous time, lingual landscape. One might have an affinity towards a non-empirical item of discourse, a referent, such as a word, i.e. apple. The word apple, opposed to the object, is adored, such that the object's relational and considerable aspects can be speculated upon, and whether corresponding with what is said to actually have happened, or what we say is capable of being imagined as to what could have happened that made that cup sentimental now but not now, or outrightly deflating the sentimental value of an item when one is cleaning out their garage and just needs to sell some items. A direct contradiction, as a signified, is a form of conceptual or lingual dissonance, followed most often by non-acceptance. A rational urge to quell or resolve dissonance appears. Acceptivism, a term coined by author Jeff Smith Ludke, or acceptism, is the idea, and I paraphrase my summation as, not too dissimilar to accepting all true things. In one case, and accepting that all things are true in another case. But in this other case, within a limited and very narrow domain, such that logical explosion and pure insanity take root in the reader's mind, and they go happily running about madly in the streets with their head cut off, or any other variable being introduced as not dissimilar, therefore identical to, by virtue of not being the same. Apparently we live in a tensed cosmos, where time reads not just change of states, of change and changing states, such that even mental events in flux and shifts are indicative measures of time, and hence our notion of past tenses and present tenses, speculation on future tenses, trustfully in most cases, i.e., I'm going to visit my parents on Thanksgiving, which is coming right up, etc. So that the identicals are also merely accepting that A on the left is identical to and from the A on the right of A equals A, and that one shouldn't attempt to take away the discrete idea of universal, transcendent, symbolic identification of identicals as the first meta-syntax that mankind has found as root agreement, which is substantiated in the sensory empirical domain as the law of excluded middle, whereby the law of the excluded middle calls upon a shared world phenomena, a field of nameable objects, i.e. rock, that groups of common language speakers can agree to, that which is rightly called a rock by all people speaking about the object here, pointing at rock. One mustn't call it a stone, as that may lead one to agree to think of the Rolling Stones the band, and hence make the word rock much more of a musical artifact of consideration when next referring to rock as a rudimentary item of discourse. Mnemonics as method of remembrance, which are necessary yet untrue, correlate to many minds' associative nature of learning. They also can inspire great creativity. The entangled strata which runs through dialetheism averages the depths of the domain of contradiction. The depth of the domain of the dialethe is such that one's foot out of the door wouldn't constitute one's person's identity, such that capital A equals lowercase a, and capital A equals capital A umlaut, whereby we defer similar differences within a contained domain of variable being both itself and not quite itself, in order to allow, in essence, a sliding scale of contradiction, because certainly doesn't equal lowercase a by nature of its denotive graphic attribute. The content of capital A-ness, regardless of font nor capitalization, retains an identicalness with itself, at least phonically, and that the fashion of each capital A via its font, or any punctuated contrasting qualities, don't overwrite the substantive content that the identicals portend to affix in any mind, in our mind. So the quality of being discrete versus porous, where discrete is a clear, succinct, distinguished boundary, and where porous is the case of a respiratory field. We might call a non-discrete delineation being semi-permeable, or discrete and yet also porous considerations of what said variable is and what it could be or could also be are at issue, and at issuance as to whether the principle of identity has greater latitude of exceptions than the law of identity seems to assist. Whereby the domain of being in an always changing real world with a reliable set of unified items that don't seem to change much at all are considered as reliable, align with the idea that logical identities such as capital A equals capital A are static, but that are able to be deferred into reliably different contextual accounts, such that capital A equals capital A umlaut, where the first A, capital A, is a narrow version of what it means to be discrete, means capital A umlaut, where capital A umlaut is the more robust contextual domain of capital A. I might here compare a respiratory field to sentimental identity about an object of discourse. Consider the sentimentality which surrounds a baseball game. One might assume its American origins, its history, the smell of people, dirt, condiments, cheers, bleachers, family times. Triads yield workarounds. The philosophy of philosophical talk seems to find a trademark of preferences when speaking about philosophy itself. Phenomenological, ontological, and epistemological triad from one aspect of the triactic perspectives, that domain within philosophy which is most often preferred is epistemology. I like to find a transparent domain of dialetheistic union, middle or intersected illustration here, page 22 of notes, domain of dissonance between epistemology and an epistemic realm, and secondly between epistemic realm, which stems from phenomenology or phenomenal experiential groundings. In other words, the first-person qualia claims spoken by the individual human organisms about knowledge, i.e., knowing a color's name. I always like to bring up the epistemic domain of a prelingual child entering into linguistics for a demarcation line between epistemic realm, where knowledge can be witnessed of and ascribed to, and one's own epistemology, one's recursive knowledge claims. Next chapter. Philosophy of human lingual development. The infant mimics and mirrors sounds and iterates patterns and tones while discovering its physiological properties, as they also relate the oral articulation by which the pre-articulate infant reiterates movement and sounds and acquires the abilities, tongue, and limbs via mirroring. Also by noticing the mirror between their left and their right body parts and their respective attributes. So the infant both mirrors its own attributes with itself, but then also begins mirroring of the parents and surrounding community. The parent will often manually move the infant's limbs to mirror their behavior, while also continuing a barrage of words and verbal sounds, as well as object sounds and textures and so forth. The infant mirroring itself, by virtue of our left side mirroring our right side, and vice versa, via number of limbs and ears, as well as our binocular eyes, as well as the quadrant of our major limbs being different than our waist horizontal axis, matching of 20 digits, 5 in each quadrant, where each quadrant is morphically assumed, whether oriented vertically, horizontally, or diagonally, to be the other quadrants, such that spatial numerical conceptions can begin to be cognized by to an infant prior to having a name title for these, like similar contrasts with their own body parts, but also the limits and the orientation that these limbs and digits can move hexaxically towards, away, front, back, down to side, and up, down in correspondence to other environmental objects, colors, contrasts, and like organisms called that infant's family. The epistemic realm allows the parents to speak together in front of the child about the child and agree that the baby knows where the mobile is in space relative to its 5 sensual senses working in congress. The context of the individual prelingual, pre-articulate human organism punctuating into language is when their sensual organism's mental yet geometrical possible combinations take on, I suspect, an internal contrast among the senses and mental apprehensions of the infant. An auto-effect and affect stems from the infant, at least enough for the infant to associate a relationship with an outside world and have an outbound relationship to particular objects, items, processes, movements, and begin to associate items within its data stream to its mother tongue's symbol for such an item. These occurrences happen such that the human infant can supplement the symbol phonically for the object. The symbol carries on in lieu of the object item. The symbol carried in the infant's mind is called a signified. After the nouns are referenced and supplemented for objects, items, and then verbs, symbol sounds become inculcated appropriately within the child's increasing lexicon. At the point where the ontologic and the deontologic natures and limits and rules come into the meta-mental frame of the emerging speaker, then and only then do organized complexities arise and speech formation combine into higher level of ordering, namely a vocally articulated and responsively engaged level of language emerges in the form of sentence dialogue. This is when random single word expressions compile into grammar per se. It is only at this division, this Rubicon passed over, when epistemology proper begins. It is after a grammar is noticed by the other language speakers that a philosopher may engage in ascribing an a priori aspect of knowledge to the child. Prior to this event of grammar appearing via articulation, the knowledge which the child possesses and exudes is a posteriori, or from its experience, coupled with third-party a priori ascriptions applied to the child. From the phenomenological vantage point, the pre-articulate child knows things outside of the a priori domain. Without grammar, a child has no epistemology, but third parties can attribute an epistemological domain to the child. Here is a variance in the categories limits that the analytical Western tradition clings to, by which I aim to make the categorical lines limits more diffuse and the categories migratory at times. Linguistics and static domains versus muting realms. One could observe the use of a word which is solidified within initial stages of learning language, like the word mama, and this could sustain for the duration of the phrase. The phase may be considered static as its components are limited. As the child supplements mom or mother for mama, we could see this move to another semi-static stage, where one solidifies a use of words and then enters into a population of other speakers, their names, definitions, and commitments to accents, dialect become tested and relegated and corrected from the community. An intersection between the pre-lingual epistemic realm and an expression of one's epistemology. The epistemologist, one who preferences epistemology over ontology and phenomenology, generally accepts Western philosophical rules of rationality. They often stem their reason itself to knowledge formation without granting over the subjective pre-knowledge phase of one's development. They often prefer to focus upon propositions per se. They do this often with a type of highbrow, overarching dismissal, considering the prelingual phase as having both a type of experiential knowledge, a posteriori knowledge, and the exclusion of a distinct philosophical use of knowledge as that which entails an examination of what another common language speaker thinks about knowledge claims, knowledge propositions. If I, as this author, introduce a dissonant definition of knowledge, such as to have the word refer point to a prelingual haptic experiential phase, then the Western rationalist objects to this use and says I'm introducing something that is like knowledge but isn't knowledge per se, and so we can call this type of knowledge smallage. My preference is to divide and relegate this differing aspects of the word knowledge as sourced from both the prelingual phenomenological experiential realm as well as, and later too, from the postlingual recursive propositionally reiterative realm, the epistemological realm, from which the word finds its Western analytic home. If we can concur about knowledge, we can confer what thing knowledge of a thing points to, refers to. So the young speakers have what more sophisticated and experienced language users call having knowledge. They have an epistemological event which their memory can later refer. After they learn the uses of the word knowledge, then they can move into picking up and using the term epistemological. Would it be fair to say pre-knowledge is smallage? Or is it more informative to say pre-knowledge is non-subjective experiential information? Following along a rule, via repeating a following along that rule, which is formed by a speaker, makes the speaker the authority of the rule. We would know they are the authority of that rule if by not following or under following the rule occurred a violation which the authority would have to police in some manner, even if the rule is enforced deontologically, as in, it is that way because I'm the mom and I say so. Like a covalent bond, the information is subjective, in that it outlines the subject and then also outlines the communal use or authority. One can hold a belief, and one can bring what they hold close to them in an inclusive, accepting manner. And one can let go of what they hold. Let go of what they had proposed via a proposition. Consider something without propositions, but later able to use propositions to analogize to a non-lingual thought. As a quadrilateral signified form becomes articulated later as a diamond, as if the consideration was merely mental, geometric projections over memories of empirically experienced objects, like a lot of land shaped like a diamond, or a conceived chunk of wood, which in thought of spatially as cut into a diamond shape, etc. Put the illustration here of this is not a pipe, honeypot painting here, a type of truncated, stellated, recombined exception. Because the proposition is a predicate about that which it will be referring to without being the only type kind of predication to that later moment, we can say that there exist non-propositions as context for a later propositional occurrence, even if that occurrence is simply to denote meaning. Here we find a meaningful difference and disjunct between propositional occurrences and sequential events, of which some, but not all, are propositional occurrences. A event, which can be seen in sequence, can be a mental event, an imagining, a geometric imagining within an eidetic realm, the conceptual realm. It may also be a gesture of another's body, or any number of media items such as radio, signs, logos, markers, glyphs. Events as indexable thoughts within one's mind might also entail abstracts or associations about a media item, such that one might construe astrological meaning from star patterns which one remembered via observing a chess move. And being of the event as signified within one's mind as an associative abstract may hold meaning without holding a proposition, whereby finding or applying or otherwise denoting a meaning to an instance holds a position in sequential events which runs contra to and may be devoid of empirical and propositional content. One's ontic positioning to this ontological instance within the sequence of events which may or may not point to an epistemological domain evidenced by propositions shows a preference to approaching knowledge from an ontological ground. Consider your visual apparatus focusing upon something. This does not mean that your mind is not observing events or facts out in the periphery. You have mental states which point to the focus, which may be cognitive, as well as holding a mental state which monitors datum from the periphery. In much the same way, we can have propositional beliefs which are cognized. We can have latent beliefs which emerge from latency when they come to mind, and we can have beliefs which are held away from cognition and from propositions. Therefore, belief has indexing which is not defined as such. Belief is an attitude towards a proposition. Assumptively anti-assumptive. In a parabolic contrapositive, looking at oneself in their opponent's reflection, while assuming that reflection is from that which is physical. Non-acceptance. You know that the problem with people is they believe what they think, is the title given to an antithesis. Next chapter. Mythic commentary on myth. Mythic aspects of language in this paper. The supernatural, which is conceived almost as if myth or magic became real and alive. The mythic supernatural intersection with the empirical is important to note. Plagiarism is hard not to do. Yet it seems that trying my patience to remember which philosopher said what, I think that when I feel like plagiarizing the idea, I'll twist, distort, and truncate some words and just carry on like nothing ever happened. On the other hand, if I feel like I'm not consciously plagiarizing, I'll also carry on my own and maybe play with phrases and punctuation regardless. In other words, it will be fine that my audience can keep up with my associations, tangents, and versatility. As formal philosophers who criticize the academic institution's laudable rules or limits of discussion, there being a tendency to amplify that which is grounded in preference to more of a mythically dominated genre of godlike, demi-godlike characteristics phenomenologically within other persons' first-person lives. As to say that the realm of imagination may, like Platonic forms, yield instruction to obtaining an individuated superpower that goes beyond social convention, at least and against the presumed laws of physics, which our professors inculcate into the student body. Antithesis is correct. Anti. The phenomena of gravity and the correspondent descriptions and mathematical interplay into describing said phenomena. It is a matter of perceptible approach to re-examine the words used to describe physics and the embedded nature of all schools of conditioning, such as to throw off the shackles that contain the soul's sui generis growth, and more precisely growth into oneself and away from the other grouped commune of notable data, strata, and vertex points passed off as content. Effect of spoken of content, and author and author's works cited. This historically appealed to chain of thinkers who were cleverly considered the network of the Western canon of thought, must reveal oversights to other less notable authors from decades, centuries, and millennia ago, whose ideas are, by most modern paradigms, super-fantastical, which are beyond the secular naturalist's scientistic predominance. Canonized Western thinkers are taught about their universities' historically embedded prior authorship, where these authors are lauded over other authors as most important to think upon and study than other authors. Many of these other authors, many of them are mythicists. These authors are dismissed as fictional and are not taken as even mistakeably as nonfiction, meaning that the realm of the mythic is often mistaken as not ever necessary, being absent of a real counterpart, meaning that people have untapped superpowers which they are afraid to name, and demonstration is an event for this next non-grounded philosophical canon of humanity called humanity's next generations, or those who broke through the mold. Imagination is more important than knowledge, Einstein. But why? Why is imagination more important than knowledge? Because the edge of genius makes myths actually happen. And still some people lay outside the restricted bounds of what physics delimits. In that I've witnessed super radical entities, such as to witness UFOs and place them in or as from another dimension, and I've assumed that there are stellated nature of a polytope where the intersection of multiple supernatural occurrences allows recognition of the natures and context of each occurrence, and that there existed more than one more than two times, and in a way now are n-dimensional in occurrence, such that the diachronic and orthographic assessment of these initial occurrences line up in a planular fashion, such as to triad in one type kind of breaches within the fabric of space-time, and normative notions of what is possible in physics being currently in a retentive state, as being the author's focus upon as most relevant within. Ties between coherence and incoherence. Ties between coherence and incoherence stem from significant combinatorial happenings not being registered as symbolically significant nor viewed as instructional from beyond, and never allowing oneself to assume that one's symbolic environment has instructional code embedded within it, which is a metadynamic which goes well beyond simply conceiving the world to be bound by secular conclusions about the mundanity of reality and the media, legal symbols within it. Mundanity is just that, mundane. And if interesting people are interested, then approaching one's environment as mundane is merely a subjugation or repression of sensing the world as programmed, there just for you. The fact that the modern zeitgeist includes video games and publicly chased Pokemon implores me to assume that the next generations are preparing to also see their indigenous empirical environment to also be filled with data points and referential clues and facts, points from which to read what the universe is saying to them. In some cases, an instructional and nomadically insistent, and in other cases, spiritually adroit. The realization of a matrix-like reality allows one to first ponder about their own biological limits and a potentiality everlasting vessel of combined energetic datasets and points, with complexities increasing as one considers our tiniest biological functions and models to the greater organ systems within which we call our bodies, to secondly, a fear about an ordered nature of the entropy of our bodies as they seem to age through time and seem to be aligned with the embedded idea that not only does one die, but that time's arrow seems to be demonstrating that this fact when bodily facts appropriate to the expected changes that we attribute to aging and the human lifestyle cycle. And yes, the having to come back to this belief about oneself in the face of personal entropic accordances with the second law of thermodynamics. Yet, platonically, as much as Christian souls are de-bodied into not dissimilar soul bodies, or in some ideal apotheosis of being the best within one's body, supernatural re-embodiment, to carouse about with God concerning the facts and decision one accepts that ones which they guilt and repent or pray or atone over. And so believing fancifully that one isn't going to biologically die is merely a type of spiritual dream for spiritually platonic formulations of our most atomized energetic sets of particulates we call our beings. When I am not in a data set of combinations which make their combination an awareness to me to follow along mentally, that is by allowing the body to do what the mind tells it, when the mind is most available to its empirical environment, while cutting away the self-complexifying nature of getting lost in thought or upon focusing upon one's internal thoughts, one is in a state of forfeiting the self-other distinction, such that what one images is the case is registered, and the next moment of one's mental attention is focused as receptive to the next message of instruction, is tempered by one's previously embedded concern about their body's well-being, or the well-being of others, such that any idea is possible to attempt, yet is tempered by one's fear of bodily damages which might ensue from profitless physiological decisions, waving to a cloud in the sky versus smoking a cigarette for the chemical enjoyment or desired sensation. The enjoyment of the practice of smoking is considered the profitable behavior, where waving to a cloud may be a vacuous process, where only one's mental enjoyment of the absurdity that what and why one is waving to a benign object, that the thought that the process may put out a message to not only the cloud, but to the matrix at large. Consider the holographic principle. In a mode that is different to the non-symbolic practice of smoking, or should I say the supposedly assumed symbolic-less nature found in the merely obtuse practice of smoking, where smoking is not unique to the bodily effects, nor the smoke is metaphor to the aesthetic affects. Towards an active and dynamic synthesis of argumentative components, this is to say, generating new strategic angles of approaching an argument, along with better methods, but also synthesizing particulate articles of ideas in order to create renewable component into the argument space. New logical approaches found via speaking, associating free associative thoughts, but while outlining a lattice of logical connections using philosophy's traditional lexicon and latest lingo when defending the collegiate mythos that secular reasoning is the best utility to reapply to religiosity when attempting to deplete the theist's claims of their theos or theistic leanings. The theist needs to generate a synthesis of argumentative components to allow varied re-examination of proposed mental domains that overlay directly with one's spiritual notion of thought itself. The theist needs a sui generis synthesizing dynamic to embolden their individual testimony towards whatever gospel or higher power idea they purport. An example of a synthetic theist component might be my speaking about the stellated extensions which are geometrically inferred by projected intersections from off of a logically reduced type of geometric object. I add that if one's thoughts are combined together by a specific number of points, that if these points are of the same object, then they form a geometry, orthographic, or 2D description of these points pointing towards or leading to a conceived vertex or intersectional point of an idea or ideal, or a topic apotheosis, or stars tine being defined, such as to assume that these intersections extensive beyond the originally considered topical domain, and that these stellated points are indicative of even greater mental components that might appear to be an alignment with another Platonic form stellated extension, or another less reductive yet constituted structure than a Platonic form, such as twisting intersections within a Mandelbrot set. That is a geometric idealism of shapes that connect with and within a fractal structure of theologic discourse, such that the extrapolation of any plane may point towards a greater truism about the logically complex nature of the universe in a knowable, mathematical, ornate structure. Will some say that nothing fails like prayer are the ones that does not recognize the answer to a prayer can be found diachronically or at another distinct time or intersecting or tangent, which expresses, if one accepts the spirit or ghost in the machine as being personal to your head, my God, and find that pain is also a correlate to one's environmental conditions, and by environment I also include the motion of the cosmos as ocean, where certain affects from the surface affect the components which immediately surround you, one, me, a windless situation, a descent into hell, a war with one's horrors, one's mind's speculations, one's imagination, where Danny Elfman's quote, "Don't be afraid of things you cannot see," does not so much imply that there exists nothing intelligent beyond what you can see, but that whatever that you cannot see with your organism's eyes, ignore to the extent that you fear the meaning that has no visual correspondence. Even if it is that which is telling you you are doing evil and wicked things and must be descending towards hell within that bifurcated binary reduction into a single data point on the side of the sheet that indicates one is in hell, hell-bound and pre-suffering prior to one's death. The inverse function of this idea might also be that God moves us, humans, towards hell and hellishly unbearable pain, to and towards our imminent biological death, and from there we are painless entities or spirit, or data sets, and what you thought was hell was just a color which you feared because it reminded you of blood, your own blood perhaps. Next chapter. Epically stellated epic stellation. The following is to show the means of formatting a proposition into a geometric relational form. The geometry of a triangle is selected in this case because it is a simple primitive and allows a visual to showcasing of relationships. In this case, the dog is on the mat. The dog and the mat are represented distinctively as the angles, yet are in relationship with one another and the speaker via lines. Both he, subject, dog, and object, mat, are in play, and the predicate verb on is absent. The hypotenuse represent the perceptions or depth of perception of each speaker. Illustrations noted here. Dog on the left, what is seen in the empirical referent mat? Person A speaks a proposition, the dog is on the mat. Person B hears a proposition over the phone or internet, the dog is on the mat, but has no empirical referent. Signified. Dog and mat. What is seen empirical referent? Person A speaks the proposition, the dog is on the mat. Right here I'm reading the contents of the illustration. Person B conceives that he cannot see the dog nor the mat by emphasizing with person A. Stellates, expanding, initial domain, replies, but I cannot see what you are seeing, so I can only trust your claim. No empirical referent, but a signified. What is seen is the empirical referent, the mat. So the stellation goes to person A. Back to person A. Spoke about the dog is on the mat. Person B In person A, stellate again. Stellates, expanding the initial paradigm. Intersubjective consensus is now achieved. The signified is shared now. Both individuals, whether person A has the empirical referent, actually organismally seeing with their eyes a dog on the mat, and person B, who only heard the claim, they both have the mental signification of a dog on a mat. Yes, now I understand, but what I am talking about is just the proposition, the dog is on the mat. So this illustration is to illustrate the proposition, now, the dog is on the mat, and exclude the referent, the empirical referent of the dog being on the mat. Person B may only refer to the proposition. The proposition per se becomes under scrutiny analysis. The referent is the proposition. So the referent is no longer the dog is on the mat. The referent is now the proposition. The dog is on the mat. Person A may still refer to either the proposition or the empirical object. A purpose of making geometric analogs to speech and propositions is to begin developing and standardizing geometric forms as primitive components in order to graphically make modular a model of one's philosophy. Traditional propositional analysis should coincide in collaboration with these geometric modules. Games and CGI emblemize imagination, make imagination something real, and can make seem real that which we take as really real. Where a small semantic unit of meaning does not emblemize an idea, but grants further ideas about the imagination and leaves the idea to form within the mind of the reader differently in form than the CGI emblems that another puts forth via their means of interpretation. How can an item in the world both be what it is and also not be what it is? Can a contradiction be considered? If a tree falls in the forest and no one is there to hear it, did it make a sound? Of course, this question is to point to not only sense datum as sound entering one's ear and not entering one's ear, but also the nature of what we call sound in terms of vibration in the air, friction and physical matter that yields a vibration, and that sound wave is audible via an organism's ear, or perhaps a recording device would suffice to describe the nature of a tree crashing, etc. When I ask the reader to think about their feet, and not the word feet, and certainly not the following word, feet, one can understand that their mind focuses upon not just the idea of feet, but their feet, and not just generically having feet, but having one's feet, one's very feet, my feet. The reader says to their self, while wiggling their toes and moving their ankle, touching it with your hands, feeling the socks, shoes, floor, etc., with one's feet, haptic sense. As the embodied organism defines facts about their embodied person, not dissimilar to any body part known to our language's lexicon, one speaks of a body part like one's nose and all that it entails. Minding your nose and remembering that we were just thinking about your feet. Notice that your eyes were not considered. The migration of conventional mental focus goes to where your mind is taken. One's scope of focus can become more general if one relaxes and just feels their entire body at once. As a whole, gestalt consideration. When one is focusing on the whole of their body, they have not lost their feet, yet the word feet that corresponds to the reader's feet is both at presence and embodied sense from within as a form of tactile qualia. We migrate from the x variable called feet, x equals feet, and defer to another focus within our consciousness, this process of phenomenology. One's haptic sense of their own embodiment as it relates to a body part and the quality of having that word associate with that part stems from one of the triad that is said to make up the parts of Western philosophy, namely the phenomenological portion. Traditionally, knowledge is considered as within the realm of logic and reason, and logic is often reduced to adhering to the three laws of logic: law of identity, law of non-contradiction, and the law of the excluded middle. These three laws are traditionally and generally relegated to the epistemological domain of philosophy's triad. Within the epistemological realm domain, traditional contradictions are considered abhorrent and dealt with as the limits of reason, edge of rationality, and the takeoff point into logical explosion if violated. Logical explosion is the idea that if there is something both itself and not itself at the same time and in the same respect, then it violates both the law of identity and or the law of non-contradiction. But not just in violation, but that if x equals not x, then any x can equal any variable, and therefore all possible variables, such as peach equals zigzag or penguin equals cups, etc. With all this being said, this logic which is consistent within the epistemological domain, but what if the reader employed is not necessarily But what if the reader employed a not necessarily strict approach to logic? And what if the logic's supposed limits, as a result, if logical violation occurs, were stemmed from the phenomenological realm? What if x equaled something like itself without being itself? Namely, if x equals feet in general, but also includes one's own felt sense embodied feet. Does x variable that composes x equal x not mean at one moment feet, and at the other moment also mean one's feet? An orthopedic surgeon works often on feet. It's his focus and focus of study. Feet are known and repaired by the people in the field. The surgeon has general approach to the facts of feet and deals with the being of feet, all facts associated with feet. The surgeon's knowledge is more general and more detailed concerning feet facts, elements and attributes in relation to the foot owner's body. The surgeon learns the facts about the feet via epistemology, yet their greater knowledge about feet and feet's relationship to the body and greater meaning of feet's relationship to the world at large denotes that the surgeon is thinking of feet ontologically. Ontology is the third domain of philosophy. If x equals feet and feet equal feet, we can assume that when one speaks of feet generally at one moment, that at the next moment they may think of feet in terms of including their feet in the identity of x, not just as facts, but as felt sensed limbs of the thinker's body, that x equals x is not discrete nor clear, such that the left x of x equals x are feet as facts, where the right x of x equals x, meaning feet as felt sense facts specifically. The migration of difference within the identity of feet yields an x equals not quite x without losing its philosophical grounding. The rationale epistemologist attempts to lock down the indexical differences between feet as logically corresponding facts and feet as felt sensed limbs, the language of logic utilizer has, such that the thinker cannot avoid including their feet, embodied feet, from the fact of feet in the world, provided that the reader hasn't suffered amputation or being born without said limbs. The epistemologist wants to know feet and logic in general and consisting in physics and reality in such a manner that the shifting distinction is considered not relevant for the purpose of mainlining logical form. The ontologist, like the surgeon, bears specific knowledge about feet and feetness and feet's relation to the body. The phenomenologist considers the first-person reference in context of what it means to have feet and feel feet and depend on feet. The phenomenologist is concerned about second-person perspective, also when speaking about Jan's feet and what Jan is expressing about her feet. The domain of the topic is tripart intersection about what feet are, mixed variable considerations of the variable feet and x equals feet. When we move our thoughts to noses and one's nose, we could speak about how the x equals feet is that x that falls into the periphery of one's horizon of mental focus. As we focus upon trees falling in woods, and whether they make a sound when no ears are around, we not only can strip away the embodied consideration about that tree's falling sounds and at the same time totally ignore whether x any longer equals feet, let alone another x. For now we speak of definitions of sound, not only in terms of being the one to hear a tree fall, but the nature of a sound as a physical vibration, a concern about physics, the ontology of physics, so to speak. So not only can we migrate amongst philosophical categories, but logical forms such as x equals x migrate in part within these categories and away from considerations altogether, such that the typer might type the symbols capital X equals, and leave the typewriter without ever returning, leaving an open-endedness. So if x doesn't equal x exactly, and the epistemologist's response is to proclaim that a violation of the law of non-contradiction has occurred, and hence logical explosion is the only remaining non-opposition to conclude or hold, then I suggest, like in the cases where x equals feet, that the contradiction of x doesn't equal x is to be a bounded contradiction, insomuch that the likeness of differing variables still exist within the philosophical triad to yield what generative grammatarians already understand, that x equals lowercase x, and not x equals p, z, and y, nor s, etc., etc., ad infinitum. Infinitum. Namely, that a bounded contradiction is in fact a contradiction, but not one that yields logical explosion proper. Instead, this type kind of contradiction is but an acceptable variance upon the variable in question, or the perspective one takes upon the variable itself. If uppercase x means feet in general, and lowercase x means embodied feet, sense specifically, then although the domains are slightly shifted, the perspectives on feetness allows the Western philosopher to obtain a paraconsistent logic where uppercase x equals lowercase x. Now, what of the case of a hologram of one's foot, a dream of one's feet, or a sci-fi consideration about a transporter beam atomizing one's feet? What is describing feet in terms of their decaying? What of taking but one's frame in time during the transporter beams atomizing one's feet, such that the feet are still called feet, but that the feet prior to transport are not quite the same corresponding feet being subject to the transport. Whereby we could say that the feet in transport are like decaying feet, but oneself being in transport or in a dream of being in a transporter beam loses correspondence with the variable definition of being feet in the migration of consideration of feet in the world, and feet as a word, and feet as a topic, and feet as a disappearing fact. Correspondence to reality ends in nature when speaking about Abraham Lincoln, because he is not around anymore. Now there are only stories of him and icons and statues. One might even argue that there never really was a man called Abraham Lincoln. Although unwise in this last assertion, correspondence may often does correspond to fleeting facts. One might say that my feet from 10 years ago are not the same feet I have today meaningfully, even perhaps physiologically, if one buys into the notion that all cells in the human body are replaced every 7 years. Fleeting facts in the face of the variable replacement language of having a meta-language that stands in for an idea is the root of mathematics as a practice and names of groups colloquially. I may be so grand as to engulf all of all existence as a type of verb. The nouns are just static and persistently stubborn verbs. Nouns are lingual declaratives of what is, while objects are fleeting away in entropy, in the second law of thermodynamics. Like time through an hourglass, so are the days of our lives. Each bit of sand is a noun, slow being denoted from a static position to a rumbling and then twisting down into the venturi. Some people suggest that pain is the definition of bad or badness, that a sentient organism's rejective reaction to stimulus is what bad is, that without pain and suffering there is no definition of badness. Some people might be wrong to conflate the word bad to surrounding pain, so much so that these speakers could replace, opposed to supplement, the word pain with bad, i.e., I have bad here. Where is bad? Here, here. How is your bad? How bad is your bad? Is your pain sexual pain that is accompanied with good sensation? The absurdity is clear that bad sensations may be painful, but not all pain is relegated to the domain of being bad. Cone structures for 3D representation of the orthographic 2D domain of triads of philosophy, epistemology, ontology, phenomenology. Insert illustration here, whereby the names for the domains are at the point tips of each cone representing the domain. There, but by symbol alone, word, episti, onto, phenomenology. Don't forget supernatural phenomenology, or, as you like to say, the phenomena of the supernatural, the visual sense verification of non-indigenous to this earth's known technological expressions type of phenomena. This is to say, psycho-assumption that a master logos via what was followed via transcendent information engagement phenomena, TIEP, leading up to the draining of knowledge as per civil deontologic rules and the maintenance of said rules as it relates to living in a society, a civil society. And after civil knowledge is launched from, one finds a deontological relation with transcendent knowledge, such that this type of knowledge is still within the realm of the epistemine, but not also outside the realm of phenomenology. And by this recent use of the word phenomenology, I mean one's first-person knowledge of all sensed and understood data as only understood by the individual to be understood by this one-time individual, and subsequently knowing that solipsism squared, the episteme of one's knowledge set, aka their specifically personal epistemology, is concerned as to run through in stellated fashion into the domain of what is ontology, believing one's ontos is real, securely, that is to say, without doubt. One believes what one observes in light of not doubting their agency within the world. This is much like the assertion that another like-world reality dimension might move through our world, upholding some of the aspects of physics as we know it, but not all, and maybe more, but that these objects move through our reality non-causally, and non-causally, yet within the domain of physical causation. Bodies of non-matter, but physical, like the flame emits heat and light, where the heat occurs physically, but the light emanates has no mass. Opposed to the light reflective off of some mass, light emanates from this foreign, alien, non-indigenous, physicalistic energy, but non-material item, such that it can both be perceived by present observers in the world, yet pass through other mass, like molecules being so far away from one another could allow objects to pass through them. Perhaps the alien other, like physical mass dimension, or understanding, being perhaps higher than our own, necessarily releases the covalent bonds making up our world's X-mass being moved through, yet allows ionic bonds to retain the base mass structure for short periods of time. Or perhaps it simply can move through all of the current understanding of electro and chemical bond fields. Imagine a stone which lays outside of the causal chain. Which other masses on our dimensional plane planet are moved through, treated as if their solidity was in question. At least no doubt at this time. One's relation to reliabilism or reliabilistic philosophical considerations about the solidity of aspect of the physical natural world, at least as it relates to being in the realm of what could be rationally and reasonably possible, RRP, rationally and reasonably possible, which is different than that which is rationally and logically possible, or reasonable and logical. And this is to say that when one extends beyond RRP, rationally and reasonably possible, with regards to one's experience, phenomenological experience, that is, then one releases the episteme to orbit, such that the domain between the phenomenological and the ontological remain. At least if one is following the transcendent divine logos, will one have sought after opportunity to find visual evidence of a higher power, a god or demigod, if you will, but some power that, like the gravitational power of the sun, has a dominant intersection with your being, meaning that one, you are subject to its insights and rule, commands, and I assume controls. The puppet master is pulling your strings, yet are these masters of the universe, our universe, my universe? Did one of my previous puppet masters send me to another master for control, as I have muted, like mutable signs do? But this mutation is for hallways and under foundation walkways well below the substratum of rational discourse's mind, RDM. At least their epistemic realm make distinct mythos, logos, gnosos, theos, falls below the bottom of the basic logical laws and identities, identicals, convention, and equivalences. The superfantastical, the supernatural phenomena in the first case was psycholinguistic engagement with the transcendent, whether it is divine or not. It is masterful of above, beyond the individual engagement with it. The divine or extravagantly well-ordered, yet powered by something well beyond the individual person's mind, meaning that the master, the puppet master, is beyond the scope of your epistemological notions, aka laws of logic, reason, and what is rational, as they are generally civilly maintained, ignored, untranslated, mistranslated, having a retention of some variable or fact or artifact within the instance, such that you trust what is accented and glutted, and ignore the gaps, silences, without need to remove what is trending normal within the discombobulation. Side note, parents may find this compatibility more antagonistic to their abilities because they are concave and internally caring with their being's movement about the care for their offspring, whereas the freedom of allowing oneself to follow a greater logos while releasing fear of one's safety may be required. In other words, to follow in the fastest means necessary, in the fashion the master God may decide one would not want to consider leaving one's child at risk or in neglect. It's not what you can do, it's what you do. Chris Terry, Utah State Arts Professor. Because you can do it, do not assume that you should do it. My paraphrase of Ed Snowden's expression, ethical expression. Dempster-Schaeffer theory, rough set theory, probabilities of doubt, levels of conflict, pianistic betting based on levels of confidence. The divine logos is called such via the Bible and its ilk, whereby God speaks aspects or the entire universe into existence via the word, the logos. Contradiction is eschewed in biblical texts. Whence we are caught up in language, we are left to assume that language itself cannot house acceptance of contradictions. Yet accepting and housing contradiction is a virtue of this writing. Western philosophy marks, maps, responds, and mirrors biblical texts in some manner, some of the time. To de-divinate the logos and destructure the mind should subsequently induce rupture within the matrix, whereby the matrix being the womb we accept as our reality, our real existence, our reality. The existence as a space is defined from our phenomenologically conscious realm, and said realm is where we acquired, use, and utilize language, the history of texts which allow a beauty and power to the word, as the pen was said to be mightier than the sword, might hold a divinity to it. But to secularize the word is in need and in utility here. To dislodge the retention of divinity as ascribed to the logos, and to reapproach all historic texts as able to be read without such an imbuement to the word, has already been achieved by scholars and commoners alike. For the divine, if maintained, holds the lofty height of the ideal of God per se, and ignores divination and divining as verb, which has contemporary association to witchery and the dark arts, worm through less than lofty and ideal heights granted to the seat of God or gods as high on or above mountain tops, summits. To and restructure Western philosophy and philosophy in general such that contradiction is no longer met with contempt will, or at least should, make primitive the considerations of the mind such that reapproach to texts will knock the syntactically lock the grapheme as syntax out of the coded gridlock such that access to the divine is available. Ironically, only via the ephemeral wail of breath, access to the cascading of meta-narratives and meta-meanings through text are the attention I'm attempting to guide the reader's mind. The ironic fact of being literate per se, that we both speak and read and write, locks us away from the tonal and impassioned allocation of words as only residing from mouth to ear, removing the eye from language, the mind of the illiterate person. Syntax itself tempers and extracts the ephemeral and passionate word and orders and relegates the divine word to operational text. The eschewing of contradiction is found within the syntax overlay upon the phoneme and not within the primitive voice of the word. As the internal virtues of a family and tribe occur prior to translation with other language-speaking tribes, as referencing a grapheme for reiterative clarity is required for all meanings beyond an empirical referent. The irony of mass literacy moving from the priestly authoritarian class to the general class is that the divine nature of the Word of God as breath of life or breath of liberty was encoded, defamed away from the vocal, where prayer to the heavens became a recitation of Scripture, keeping minds thoroughly pressed away from the divine and irony of the grandest sort, codifying a limit of the divine word marked by the binding about books. Since it is difficult to remediate one's literacy, I want to unpreference the text, the syntax, and the symbol, have the reader self-relegate syntax to a pedestrian class. How to convey to the reader the diminishment of text itself, text generally, a manner of bringing the tangential thoughts of the reader can have beyond the text which they are reading, which occurs quite often about, although unrelated topics, and directing the tangent of the unrelated topics back into the text, that text, this text, as if to stupefy the reader's peripheral scope and tendency to escape the writing into ponderous thought, and instead employ the stupefaction process as a truncation of peripheral scope, such that all peripheral thoughts are paradigmatically entailed to the text in non-dilated focus. As of the reel-in, curve, and bow all tangents of thought into and through that text, to force that syntax to have voice, to encode a meta-voice beyond mere meaning consumed from the texts, and beyond the normative voice in one's head, to a secondary voice which echoes the primary voice, such that each word of the text is echoed to the reader, for the reader, mimicking without mocking one's presumed internal monologue, as if the operation of self-prescribing and echoing the voice with a differing pitch and adjacent could follow echo and supplant one's regular accompanying voice. To read this book with the voice of Mickey Mouse or John Wayne as your own, this exercise to demand a tunnel of variant echoes of meaning through all textual reads, and to allow unprecedented exceptions to meaning to, at the very least, be considered, if not to become a necessary othering of interpretation than the rational or logical confines, which constrict you from contradictions, to allow a worming into text and an exhuming of voice from the entrapped grapheme word letter. Computer programmers who type code at the most foundational levels of software, computer code language creators, as well as those who practice the utility of coding, are doubly encoding the grapheme from letter to alphabet to casual electrical presence 256-bit software switches, reducing the voice to the atomization of bits well below the smallest semantical unit. Paradoxically, to this reduction affords an increase in novel variants of technological expression, a new standardization of communication, a decrease of variable ground, a new module towards voluntary ubiquity, a new foundation for truth to declare itself ad hoc. Block if and if statements with optional else and else if clauses to provide improved language support for structured programming. Remember that the numeral 0 is often considered even due to it's a multiple of 2. It is also not an odd number because of parity, so binary from 0 or 1 are different in even-odd distinction. If all ideas are interpreted or reinterpreted as a metaphor for some fact of the reader's life or experience, then all experiences point to the individual. The interpretation of meaningful datasets towards the self runs contrary to the more traditional pedestrian interpretation of words, such that the pronoun his is not to be interpreted as mine, regardless of the individual's ability to interpret this as such. Stellation is a kind of Platonic form activity, essentially a planular, or I suppose linear, extrapolation of, as an extension from, a Platonic form's planular edge to a point, or intersectional reduction, a way in which to analogize stellation would be to say that an ankle amputee feels phantom pain as if the foot still exists. The pain is stellated from the amputated limb. This is the end of the second recording of Embedded Contradiction by Michael Fahl.